This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click a big red button that says Patreon and support us. We are counting on you. This episode is part of a series generously sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, where we examine democracy, populism, and authoritarian trends in the region and around the world.
And we're very happy to welcome to the show one of the world's authorities on this topic. Professor Jan Werner Müller is a professor of politics at Princeton University. He studied at the Free University in Berlin, University College in London, St. Anthony's College in Oxford, and Princeton University. He is the author and editor of 8 books, widely translated, including What is Populism? But what we're going to try to do today is touch on a number of his research themes because they'll take us well past the introductory aspect of populism. And you are speaking to us from Princeton. As our listeners know, we've gone global in these remote days. And Jan Werner Müller, thank you and welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So we don't want to necessarily review all the introductory aspects of populism, but rather we want to use it as a jumping off point to go more deeply into some of the problems with democracy today. But I'd like you to just start, if you can, by characterizing what you think is the specific difference that we see in the current populist trends over the last decade or 2 decades that distinguishes it from other populist movements in history.
So maybe it's worth clarifying for just a second what we mean when we talk about populism. It's sort of conventional wisdom to say that anybody who, as the phrase goes, criticizes elites or is angry with the establishment is therefore automatically a populist, and it's often implied somehow dangerous for democracy. Now, it's true that populists, especially when they're in opposition, criticize sitting governments and other parties. But above all, they do something else. They say that they and only they represent what populists often call the real people, or also the silent majority. So what matters about populism, in my view, is not anti-elitism somehow. All of us can criticize the powerful. That's not in and of itself something dangerous for democracy. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. What is dangerous, and in a sense also specific about populism, is a certain type of exclusionary anti-pluralism, which in the case of right-wing populists usually just means that they claim that certain minorities, usually already vulnerable minorities, don't really belong to the people, and that in some cases, as we see, for instance, today in India, that it's a free-for-all as far as inciting hatred against these minorities is concerned. Now, I actually don't think this is different from what we've seen in the past necessarily. It's a similar playbook, but it certainly seems to be spreading because some of these actors are observing each other and they're seeing that some of these strategies are working out very well and they're copying each other.
Is it because the foundations of democracy have eroded? Has it got any, structural aspect to it, this rise of populism that we see?
It certainly has some structural aspects. At the same time, I think it's kind of ironic that, people often say, oh, populists, they're the great simplifiers, the world is so complex. But let's be honest, we would love it too if somebody could give us in 280 characters or less, the one macro cause, the one globally relevant structural problem that explains all these developments everywhere. I know this sounds incredibly pedantic, but that's partly what you get if you invite professors on the show, to say national contexts still matter a great deal. So the reasons for the rise of, let's say, Jean-Marie Le Pen in France, or Jörg Haider in Austria, or Trump in the US, Orban in Hungary, dare I say Netanyahu in Israel, these are not all totally identical, such that, if we only found, the one cause and kind of addressed that, then we would have it all solved. Of course, as many observers have said, yes, it matters that inequality has been on the rise. Yes, it matters that questions about borders and belonging are more in play than they may have been in public debate a couple of decades ago. But I think most of that is still not specific enough. And two of the things that I would highlight that people don't, I think, talk about enough is that it certainly helps populist political entrepreneurs, if you like, if you already have some kind of sense of an ongoing culture war, or if you already have cleavages or conflicts in a society such that they can use that they can kind of work with that to basically tell people, here's the real people, and these others don't truly belong. So Viktor Orban didn't have to invent from scratch some kind of sense that, okay, here's the real Hungary, which is rural and very religious, and here is Budapest, which is cosmopolitan, liberal, and of course, this, as you know, works very well by bringing up certain old anti-Semitic cliches as well. So he didn't have to invent that; that was already there. And in the same way, in many other countries, it's been helpful to have a certain kind of conflict already in play. Now, that doesn't mean that these outcomes were predetermined. It still took sort of very clever political entrepreneurs and other structural problems, such as rising inequality, to make this populist playbook work. But it certainly helps.
Okay.
And the other aspect, if I may, the other aspect I would simply bring in is that rather than this all being structurally determined, is that it still depends on actual decisions by individuals which could have gone another way. To simplify a very, very complicated story, I think it's true that up until today, nowhere in Western Europe or North America have right-wing populists come to power without the support, or I would even say collaboration, and I use that word consciously with all its historical overtones, without the collaboration of very established conservative elites. And these actors could have made different decisions. The Republican Party could have made a different decision in the US. German Christian Democrats could have decided not to support Viktor Orban, and yet they made a certain choice. And I think that's often left out in these sort of macro structural accounts, which often make us believe that some of these developments are now simply inevitable.
Right. And, on that note, we want to talk a lot about that, but I want to clarify one more thing. It sounds like all the examples you've raised so far have related more towards right-wing nationalist and conservative politics. And I want to know if, in your understanding of populism, is it something that is owned or associated more by the right than the left? Or would you fall out on a sort of understanding of populist tactics that define the loyal people versus everybody else, and it could belong to either? But in our historic circumstances, we're seeing it more associated with the right.
I would agree with your latter point. So in theory, populism can go either right or left. In the case of left-wing populism, we have a pretty obvious example in our day. In Venezuela, clearly there came a point at which it was impossible to have anything like a legitimate form of disagreement with Chavez. So the content can come from different parts of the ideological spectrum. But what is indeed specific to our era is a certain radicalization of the right. What is also specific is what some of my colleagues, I think, have correctly identified as a tendency to mainstream the far right. The borders between the far right and what used to be seen as normal, quote-unquote, conservative parties, Christian democratic parties, and so on, is becoming a lot more blurred. And the radicalization of the right is also something that we, of course, clearly see in government. We see it with figures like Modi. We obviously see it in the case of somebody like Trump. I think it's hard to deny that this is the most distinctive characteristic of the early 21st century.
The interesting thing also about contemporary populism is that these movements aspire to gain political power, embracing the political culture of the establishment while resisting it in a way. As you said, this is really the tenet of populism. It's not just the established powers that embrace them, but it's a two-way street in a way. And that brings me to ask you whether you think that labeling this current stage in our political moment as illiberal democracy, do you think it's appropriate?
Do you believe in Orban?
I would say two things. So illiberal democracy, as it is now promoted by the likes of Orban, is a form of false advertising. And those observers, even though they claim to be neutral, even though they claim to use this concept as if it were a kind of social scientific designation that everybody can recognize, in a sense are doing the Orbans of this world a big favor. Why? Because what Orban is in a sense trying to suggest is that, Hungary and comparable countries like Turkey and Poland are still perfect democracies. They've just rejected liberalism. And what this leaves out is the fact that democracy is not just elections. It's also rights, basic rights, fundamental rights, which are constitutive for democracy itself. Things like free speech, free assembly, just to mention the obvious ones. And yes, of course, all these countries still have elections, but these fundamental rights have been seriously weakened. So if we kind of concede that, yeah, these are still democracies, just now it's the illiberal variety, we don't see that. And on a more strategic level, if I may put it that way, we are doing them a big favor because they don't want to be liberals anyway. So if, well-meaning people in Brussels from the European Commission say, you, Orban, you're no longer a good liberal, Orban says, great, thank you for certifying me as an anti-liberal, because that's what I want to be anyway. But if one were to seriously say, look, you're not just weakening something called liberalism, which most of these actors kind of rebrand as, it's all about same-sex marriage, it's all about social issues, lifestyle choices, and so on. If one made the serious case, as one should, that no, it's democracy itself which is being weakened, in some cases is being abolished, these actors would have a much bigger problem, because their citizens, they don't want to live in a dictatorship. They don't want to live in a kind of situation where they feel, okay, the one thing that many of us fought for so hard is being taken away by, in the case of Orban and many others, basically a kleptocratic elite.
Well, what do you think it says about, good old-fashioned conservatism? I mean, is it really depleting it in a way? Because conservatives, really, what they have been trying to do all along is really to harmonize those liberal values with some sort of, traditionalism that Orban is also trying to do, but in a very different way. How do the two clash, in your view?
I think there is something really interesting going on and shifting in our era. It's sort of conventional wisdom that, the big problem today is for social democrats because, they're declining everywhere. But at least on an intellectual level, I think most people still have a rough sense of what social democracy is actually supposed to stand for, which are the kind of central values and ideas. On the center right and among conservatives, I think it's become a lot more uncertain. And we see a lot of interesting intellectual shifts in a whole variety of countries. And we see, for instance, an attempt by a certain type of conservative to dissociate, usually himself, not herself, from libertarianism. This has become very strong in the US. We see at the same time a tendency among religious conservatives, especially Catholic ones, to go in a much more radical direction and to almost try to jump back to an era where the Second Vatican Council hadn't happened yet. So I think a lot of conservative intellectuals themselves think that something isn't quite right with what de facto across the West had become a sort of settlement between, let's say, traditional / religious moral precepts on the one hand and free market precepts on the other. Now, having said that, I think what de facto, though, very often happens is that some of these actors, going back to Orban for a second, now all of a sudden have discovered these fantastic, in their view, fantastic anti-liberal experiments in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, etc., where it seems, finally governments are serious about, let's say, true natural law precepts, no abortion for anybody, that sort of stuff, as opposed to what, in the eyes of these conservative intellectuals, is sort of wishy-washy Christian democracy. Think of the fact that even Angela Merkel, it seems, can nowadays live with same-sex marriage and so on. And if I may put it very bluntly, these sorts of conservative intellectuals are basically the useful idiots of these regimes. They're not that different from left-wing intellectuals who went to the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s and said, look, it's great around here. I didn't see any camps. Everybody seems to be happy. Because what they don't want to see is that, their sort of enforcement of supposedly non-negotiable natural law precepts goes in hand with the erosion of democracy, goes in hand with all-out kleptocracy. Now, maybe some of them see that, and that's sort of the really maybe new phenomenon. Maybe some of them even see that. And like conservative intellectuals in the 20s and 30s, they say it's an acceptable price. Democracy is secondary for us. What matters above all for us are these non-negotiable religious precepts.
Well, I want to ask you, since you've raised this question about the challenge of sort of assimilating a modern form of Christian or Catholic values to the current state of democracy, I mean, what is the gap between the theory of Christian democracy and the way it has manifested itself in party politics? You've written about this in an important article from 2013, and I want to understand that gap because it seems to me that you were positing that the theory of Christian democracy might actually be a kind of bridge to bringing the two sides together in a way that co-opts these more conservative forces to harmonize with democracy, but that in reality, well, I'd be curious to hear how you describe what happened in the party manifestation of that.
So I think in many ways, traditional Christian Democrats lost their way over the last 20 years. And this is partly to do with indeed larger structural challenges. So Christian democracy was so strong, so hegemonic in countries like Italy and Germany in the post-war period, because these were the quintessentially anti-communist, anti-totalitarian, but not far-right, not nationalist sorts of parties. And with the end of the Cold War, also with the decline of a particular kind of class coalition that backed them, and which incidentally also backed the early phases of European integration, so middle-class business and peasants, a lot of these sort of structural background conditions disappeared. And at the same time, on a more intellectual level, a lot of the party leaders and thinkers sort of had a hard time finding ways of making some of their specific ideals, such as pluralism, subsidiarity, basic human rights, but understood in a very communitarian fashion. They found it difficult to kind of update that for a, forgive the rather cliched way of putting this, a more individualistic sort of age. So I think they do have a genuine problem. It's not like, oh, this is all just a question of failing in terms of political strategy. But what has put additional pressure on them is that now far-right populists often present themselves as the real Christian Democrats. Again, this is very typical of Orban, who says, look, these Western European Christian Democrats, they're not the real deal anymore. What we're doing here is the real thing. And that, again, is a form of false advertising, because the original Christian democracy was very anti-nationalist, was very anti-sovereignty, even as an idea, because they were very skeptical about the notion of the nation state. That's partly why the founders of European integration were basically all Christian Democrats. And most important of all, for these far-right populists like Orban or like Salvini, who's often really tried very hard to co-opt religion for his program, basically belief doesn't matter. What you actually do as a religious actor is completely irrelevant. It's purely about collective identity and belonging. And that's just another way of saying that it's all about demarcating a border with those who don't really belong or who pose a threat, which in the case of these actors very obviously is Muslims above all.
Right. And would it be correct?
Sort of puts up, yeah, go ahead.
Would it be correct to characterize one of your conclusions that religion itself can have a place even in a democracy and even in the political system of a democracy as long as it submits to the authority of democratic institutions? Is that the key to kind of co-opting the political forces of religion?
So I'm not, in a sense, in the business of telling these actors what they should or shouldn't do about religion. There's nothing prima facie wrong with claiming to represent, let's say, the religious parts of your population. That's not in and of itself a threat to democracy or a problem in and of itself. The problem starts to appear if you use that to basically incite hatred against others, if you basically start to deny the standing of other citizens and start to say things like only a Christian member, let's say, of our polity is a true, take your pick, Hungarian, German, whatever, then we get into difficulties normatively and politically. Beyond that, personally, I think in many cases it's perfectly acceptable to do what, of course, is often done in the US, but which is not always very popular in Europe, namely the idea that, yes, it can be completely okay in the name of anti-discrimination or non-discrimination to give religious actors certain exemptions. But that's, in a sense, a very separate issue from the question of how does religion get mobilized by political actors and gets translated into actual power in party systems.
But what about the place of religion in the actual establishment itself? Where does Christianity and democracy, where do they clash, if at all? In Israel, the constitution of the State of Israel as a Jewish democracy is replete with problems.
He means the basic law.
Let's not go there. But I'm just interested to hear, if there are any parallels, you think, with Christian democracy.
Well, I think the problem consists in situations where a state essentially says we endorse a form of religion, and if you as a citizen don't, you are at best second rate. I think this is the core normative challenge in terms of how religion might get translated into politics in the wrong kind of way. And one of the, if you like, achievements of these Christian democratic parties was that they eventually let go of this notion that you should instantiate religious truth in politics and basically use collective life to realize your religious values, and as a side effect, often unintended, but certainly sometimes also intended, exclude certain parts of the population. That's why I think it's problematic if you basically have a state telling its citizens there is only one correct way of understanding our national identity, and it comes with a heavy dose of religion, it comes with a heavy dose of a highly particularly understood form of cultural identity. Democracy is unthinkable without pluralism, which is not to say that, the more diversity necessarily, the better. That's not what pluralism necessarily stands for. It stands for the basic intuition that in a heterogeneous society, we got to find ways of living together on fair terms. And that means we're going to have to accept people whose ideas of the good life, whose ideas of religion sometimes radically differ from ours. But we can find ways of living together with them in a fair way, telling them that unless you conform to our officially prescribed notion of what it means to be a good citizen, I think is an unfair way of doing that.
Well, one of your interesting themes I found is the idea that democracies have sometimes tried to build safeguards against the very sorts of threats you're talking about, internal actors who would try to stamp out that pluralism or destroy the capacity for pluralism. And I'm referring to your writing about militant or fighting democracy. Can you explain what that is? Why did it emerge? And what is the paradox that it creates?
So militant democracy refers to the notion that sometimes the basic, fundamental democratic rights of certain actors have to be restricted for the sake of preserving democracy. This idea came out of the experience of the Weimar Republic, where many observers concluded that if only the Nazi Party had been banned in time, or maybe also if the rights of the Communist Party had been restricted in certain ways, then the Republic would have been saved. For some observers, this is deeply paradoxical because they say, look, you are basically trying to save democracy by, in effect, damaging or maybe even outright destroying democracy. Because, once you start restricting rights, you are actually the agent of at least damaging democracy. And remember that all this is in the context where political actors are not doing things which are already covered by the criminal law. So we're not talking about terrorism. We're not talking about things which are illegal anyway. We are talking about things like forming a party, engaging in certain kinds of speeches, which, from a more libertarian point of view, could be read as perfectly acceptable, not as illegal in a democracy. So this idea flourished in the post-war period in particular, but not only in West Germany, where the Communist Party and the de facto successor party of the Nazis were banned in the course of the 1950s. There have also been more recent attempts to ban, yet again, a party which, in the eyes of its critics, certainly comes close to being the de facto neo-Nazi party on the ground. Now, the problem is that in many ways, this looks like a sort of very 20th century kind of instrument, because many of the real threats to democracy today come from actors who say, but look, we are the real Democrats. They don't always call themselves populists, but some of them actually do. We are the ones who actually, stand up for the people against the elites, who are not doing anything necessarily undemocratic. And in many of these cases, it might be very hard to prove conclusively that, yes, they are really systematically trying to undermine democracy.
Right. I mean, it becomes a question of which actor is actually destroying democracy. I mean, one of the things we've seen in the more populist discourse in Israel is the sense that the people, the majority, must be the sovereign. And so anything that is constrained, for example, by the Supreme Court, and this is a similar problem that we have in Hungary and in Poland, gets accused of being a dictatorship against the voice of the true people. So is this a moral equivalency? Is there any way to determine which is the real threat to democracy?
Well, democracy does not mean majority can do whatever the hell it wants. The majority must preserve the conditions of the minority at some point becoming a majority.
And what if the majority doesn't agree with that?
Well, then you maybe have a different conception of what politics should be about, and one that is not entirely covered by the notion of democracy. Democracy is an ongoing game. And if somebody says, look, just because we won this round, we're going to make it impossible for anybody else ever to win this game again, maybe that's not a proper understanding of how the political game should be played. So this works both ways, though. I mean, this is. I mean, of course, the major worry today very often is about a kind of unbridled majoritarianism. But you can also have the opposite problem, where a party that lost an election feels like look, we're going to exert power anyway. Just think back to how Mitch McConnell, the great gravedigger of American democracy, said, "I'm going to obstruct Obama in whatever way I can."
And then followed through on this promise.
It's perfect. Yeah, it's perfectly fine that a majority gets its way after an opposition has had its say, but always in circumstances where the conditions of a minority one day becoming majority again, if people change their minds, as they after all very often do in democracies, are preserved. So one way of putting this very succinctly, and I'm following the insight of a Polish-born American scholar of comparative politics, is simply to say democracy is a system where parties lose elections. This can sound incredibly banal, but it's actually a profound insight. If there is no longer a real chance of a turnover of power, that's a pretty strong indication that whatever we're dealing with, it's no longer democracy. And that if members of a certain type, if citizens say, oh, but it's still democracy because I'm always getting my way, that's not good enough as an argument to make the claim that democracy is still real.
Having considered all this that you say about the essence of democracy, and going back to what you said about Christian democracy earlier, do you think, taking perhaps a historical perspective, that Christianity is an essential part of the genealogy of democracy? I mean, is it just a coincidence that modern democracy emerged out of Christendom, do you think?
I don't think this is an essential component of democracy, or that there is some kind of determinism about, you had to have that particular religion in place, otherwise you couldn't possibly have democracy. The world's largest democracy right now, even though a democracy that clearly is under dire
grave
threat,
yeah,
from its leader, somehow seems to have worked for a long time as a very pluralistic, no doubt in many ways also, problematic, but still highly pluralistic polity for a very long time. So I don't see that. I don't see that genealogy.
Just to be clear, I assume you're talking about India. Is that correct?
It's India. I'm talking about India, but also I think we tend to forget that, remember all these debates that we've had over the last couple of years where, learned scholars come and say, oh, but, Islam couldn't possibly ever become democratic because, look, Christians did it, Catholics did it, but that's because they have a thing called the Vatican, where at one point the Pope told everybody in a binding way that now democracy was the way to go. These poor benighted Muslims don't have that. They don't have a church. So how are they going to get to democracy? People tend to forget that all these things that nowadays tend to be said about Islam were said about Catholicism for many decades. You could have learned scholars at prestigious American institutions up until the 1950s, sometimes in the 1960s, basically explain to you in great detail why the Iberian Peninsula and why Latin America were never really going to be democratic because they were afflicted with Catholicism.
And the same was said about Ireland.
And the same was said about President Kennedy before he became president. He couldn't possibly be president of the U.S.
I'm not saying that we should equate these religions or these differences don't matter. Of course not. But these sort of macro casual condemnations of certain religions as basically being hopeless, I think they don't go together with the fact that India, after all, of course, also contains 200 million Muslims. Indonesia, again, for all its problems, seems to be working reasonably well as a democracy. So, these sort of casual macro diagnoses, I think, are not helping our capacity for political judgment, with all due respect.
I want to talk about one of the very interesting and very modern, I would say, post-war mechanisms out there for trying to help democracies stay that way. And this is, I really think, one of the most interesting discussions to be had. The European Union. What can be done about members who are backsliding from their democratic commitments? And, if the EU decides that it has a role, does it simply risk a backlash and the accusation of meddling into internal affairs if the EU tries to take action against a country that is going in an illiberal direction or a proto-authoritarian direction?
This has been said many times in recent years with regard to what has been happening in Hungary and Poland in particular. I think it's misguided for two reasons. One is a more abstract point about what the European Union is really about. It really is about states coming together and trusting each other's institutions. So, yes, it's a market, of course. Yes, it has all kinds of aspirations to a certain type of global power as well. But ultimately, it's about saying that citizens of country A should accept decisions by a court in country B because we all mutually recognize each other as functioning liberal democracies, as having the rule of law, and so on. If that is undermined, and this might not always be obvious, this is not as spectacular as, let's say, the euro currency collapsing or anything like that. But if that goes, then the heart of the whole enterprise is dead, and that's exactly what is happening at the moment. So I think the leaders of the EU should recognize that even though it's not always as visible, it doesn't always make headlines, it really destroys the institutional structure itself.
And it's interesting. Go on.
Yeah, just on the backlash itself. This has often been said in terms of, if you now are too tough with Budapest, if you're too tough with Warsaw, and so on, you're going to have an outbreak of nationalism. But look, these leaders, Kaczynski and Orban, they are engaged in nationalist mobilization anyway. It's not like Brussels pussyfooting around has prevented Orban from, spending huge amounts of taxpayer money on having anti-Brussels campaigns with posters, etc., everywhere. So it's happening anyway. And to the extent that we have surveys about these countries which can still be trusted, the EU is incredibly popular in Hungary and Poland. If you actually sort of put these people on the spot and said, if you're serious, if you don't like this whole club, if you don't be a member anymore, you can leave. Anybody is free to leave, of course. Article 50 of the treaty. They would be horrified, and their citizens would be horrified. So I think this is something that unfortunately Brussels leaders have bought in as an idea. They've been convinced that, yes, we got to go easy on these people, when in fact the opposite is the case. And by so often doing nothing, what you actually end up doing is letting down all those citizens of, let's say, Hungary and Poland, who in 2004, when these countries joined the EU, thought, okay, thank God, there's no path back ever to autocracy. We're safe now in this club of democracies. And we have sorely, sorely disappointed and let down all these people.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point. And I also think that one of your other explanations for the justification for Europe trying to, safeguard this liberal approach is that you use the term moral quarantine in 2015 article well before Corona, but I think it makes an interesting point that it's not just about whether the EU is intervening in an individual state, but about the something like contagion. I mean, is that what you meant? That, in other words, this is problematic for the other states of the EU?
What I meant was that the specific article that the European Union has in the treaty to kind of basically do something about a member state that is no longer in compliance with so-called fundamental values such as democracy and human rights. This article, this whole development was majorly impacted by an episode you will remember from the very beginning of the century, Austria in 2000, the rise of Jörg Haider and his far-right Freedom Party, the inclusion of that party in the government in Vienna in those days. Basically, that prompted a lot of thinking about what can be done in a situation like this. But interestingly, it wasn't really about intervening in a country. It doesn't actually allow the EU to change a government. And arguably, you might say, well, that's a good thing too, because why should Brussels have a sort of blanket authorization to do that? But at the same time, its real meaning is we basically suspend the influence of that country in the EU as a whole, because a government that is no longer in compliance with these fundamental values cannot make decisions about EU regulations, directives, and so on. So it's basically a way of saying we don't want to have anything to do with, I hesitate to use these medical metaphors because I think they're very dangerous, but for the sake of argument, we don't want to be infected with the contagion of whatever politics is happening in that country. But note the reverse side of this. In theory, it also means that a government in a country that is going down an authoritarian path could say, we don't care. As long as we're in the club and as long as we get the subsidies for agriculture, let's say, we're very happy. They actually are leaving us alone. Sorry, we can't turn up at these summits anymore and wine and dine with the European Commission, but we don't care. So in a sense, it points to a very deep structural problem, namely the fact that you cannot actually legally eject a country from the EU at all. So in theory, even if tomorrow, somewhere the army says it's time for a coup, it's not obvious what the EU could do legally other than simply saying we're going to isolate that country, we're going to insulate ourselves from that country, but you can't actually force an exit. An exit is always, at this point, going to be voluntary.
All right, Professor Jan Werner Müller, Professor of Politics at Princeton University, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on the program.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this series. And now we've got a request. Most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. We accept all sorts. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews to keep you entertained and hopefully annoyed. If you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And don't forget to follow Dalia and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.